right, this is Hollywood, JP Hollywood. Glenn and John. Seems pretty likely that the Supreme Court will be neutering racial preferences with the Harvard and UNC cases this fall. Assuming their usage in admissions will be curtailed, do you believe that the DEI apparatus will sharply pivot to a more economics and class-based preference, assisting lower and middle income applicants in lieu of racial preferences? Or do you think we'll see hysteria, white supremacy and racism is ever present, hot takes? And for these administrators to double or triple down on their existing project and to find as many loopholes to still make race as important in admissions as it has been. Maybe make parts of the applications, grades, and test scores completely optional would be one way of doing that. Then thinking through the impact of the elimination of race from applications, do you believe that by doing so, it will actually help close the Black, white, Asian gap on test scores? I think back to John mentioning that he knew he didn't have to work as hard in high school and therefore didn't. However, but race no longer played a material role, that attitudes will change without race playing a material role. Attitudes will change for many as good enough will no longer cut it. So that's JP Hollywood asking about the implications of the pending neutering of affirmative action by the U.S. Supreme Court. Will it revert more to a class-based system, and will it have material effects on the performance of students by changing their incentives?
What do you think, Glenn?
I think it may well and should expand on the class front. I think legacy admissions, if not legally, then somehow politically will be more difficult to sustain if the Supreme Court rolls back racial affirmative action. And you'll get a little bit of traction in terms of racial diversity representation by expanding the class emphasis in affirmative action. But there are a lot of lower middle class and low income white people, a lot of them, a lot more than there are lower class and lower income Black people. And the test score gap is also present amongst the lower economic ranks in terms of race. The average, the number of low-income African-Americans who are testing in the right tail of the distribution of SAT or ACT performance is very scant. So I don't know if you're going to get a whole lot more racial diversity if you go in a straight class-focused way. But I think there'll be some tendency to go into that direction. But I think the main takeaway is that institutions are committed to diversity. They think that that's racial, demographic diversity. They think that's a very fundamental part of what they're trying to achieve, and that they'll look for workarounds. And I expect that the abandonment of those instruments of assessment, which are most disparate in the hit that they have, will be the first step. And that will be a lowering of the rigor of academic standards that are applied and an emphasis on other kinds of qualities of students that are presented more equally across racial groups, like their activities and extracurricular and their leadership qualities, and emphasis on the essay, life experience, and things of this kind. I think there will, if the racial affirmative action is prohibited, as the plaintiffs request in the Students for Fair Admissions lawsuits, the net effect is going to be a transformation of the way in which all students are evaluated for admissions, with less emphasis on grades and test scores as criteria of assessment. Yeah, I don't know about the performance question. That's very speculative. He asked, I'm sorry to go on just for a moment, will there be a big impact on the gap? I'm hesitant to, I'd just be talking out of my head. I'd just be guessing. I mean, there's very little empirical evidence that would allow me to have a confident assessment. My qualitative belief is that we would move in the right direction in terms of increasing the incentives for performance, because as you say, If you know you're going to get in with a B and not an A- average, that does take some pressure off. So I think that's the direction that it goes in. But the magnitude of that effect, I have no way of assessing.
I agree with you in every way. Talk about wisdom. I saw what happens when you get rid of racial preferences when I was at UC Berkeley. The kind of people who run those programs are going to go down to their deaths fighting for diversity, which in their version means they think of it as racist to submit Black students to the same level of competition as others. They wouldn't put it that way, but to them, to just let us sink or swim, even if we are affluent, is morally wrong. If any of them understand how condescending and fake that is, they're definitely not going to admit it in front of one another. There's that corporate aspect to it. And you can't kill that by changing the law. And so they are going to desperately try to work around these measures. One way, you can already see it coming based on things that are happening with public schools in cities, is a zip code diversity. And what that's going to do is, frankly, it's a good thing. It's going to get poorer Black people. But the problem is there's no such thing as using zip code to bring in more middle-class Black people. That's vanishingly rare. If you do that, you're going to scoop in all of these inconvenient white and Asian and South Asian people too. Because as Cheryl Cashin, the, I think, Georgetown, at least back then, law professor wrote, she wrote a book called It's Not the End of Integration, something about integration. And it was, frankly, she's brilliant, but it was a really mean little book. And what she was basically saying was Black people who are middle class don't think that you can move into a middle class Black neighborhood without poor Black people following you. And what she meant was that, an all Black middle class zip code is rare. And so the zip code thing isn't going to quite work. I'll bet another thing that's going to happen is quietly people are going to be urged to develop a sensitivity to what an African last name is, because you can kind of tell if somebody has Nigerian parents or something like that. That'll be one way of getting a Black person. You can't do it with Caribbeans and Black Americans because Washington and Anderson could go both ways. But the idea is if it's Okungwalu or something like that, it's a Black person. So there's going to be a sensitivity to that. Also to what people say in the essay. People are going to be directed to call attention to their race in the essays. After all of that is said and done, though, still, what you can expect, I'm going to predict this. 10 years from now, there'll be articles written by earnest, mostly Black writers saying that it's now harder to get into these schools as a middle-class Black person than it used to be. That it's not what it used to be, that there are some workarounds, but it's no longer that a guidance counselor can count on an outright Black bonus. It's a little harder. I think to that extent, maybe there will be a 1/3, maybe 1/4 increase in the extent to which Black American middle class and affluent kids realize they just have to do the work. That'll start getting around to an extent. I'm trying to think like an economist, but the powers that be are going to fight this tooth and nail, no matter what the law is. Their idea is that to submit Black kids to serious competition is morally wrong, and nothing will shake their corporate commitment to that canard.
I have to say here that I wrote an academic paper with Roland Fryer and my student Toga Uret called Colorblind Affirmative Action that was published in 2008, if I'm not mistaken, in the Journal of Law, Economics, and Organization. It can be looked up. But Colorblind Affirmative Action, in which we did a quantitative analysis of the optimal, the best, second best way of admitting a class when you want to get racial diversity, but you're not allowed to use overt racial preferences. And the bottom line on it was you look for proxies. And that kind of summarizes what you just said. You can use a last name if it's an ethnic identifier. You can use a zip code if it's a geographic identifier. And our point in the paper was to point out that when you use proxies instead of using race directly, you get much less efficient at what you're doing. You sacrifice target efficiency, and you alluded to that, what we economists call target efficiency, because you go by a zip code and, you end up not getting the Blacks that you want to get. Forgive me for talking so crudely. What you want to get is the Blacks who are as absolutely fit and qualified to succeed in your institution as is possible, given that they're Black, which means more likely than not, they're going to be privileged Blacks. They're going to be Blacks whose parents have college education, and they're going to be Blacks who went to a really top-rate high school and things of this kind. And when you're not allowed to use race directly and you have to go the indirect route, you end up getting Blacks, but you don't necessarily get the ones that you want because they're difficult to identify by the indirect routes, this kind of idea. So, yeah, I think you're onto something there.